the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, to the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, just want to mention we have a Patreon account, patreon.com/MUHH. Consider dropping us $1 a month there, or if not, maybe leave us a nice review on iTunes. We'd appreciate either route. But today we're going to be looking at Plato's Symposium, and I think it'll become evidently clear as we work through this discussion, the relevance to the discussions we've been having with regard to psychoanalysis, but Taylor can probably fill in like on the philosophy side. I read this highly through the lens of psychoanalysis.
It's not a bad framework to have to look at Plato from the vantage point of Freud or Lacan. I mean, they both, Lacan is perhaps sometimes more indirect with his references, but Freud brings up Plato's Symposium directly in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and I'm trying to think the other place. I believe
I didn't remember that, but I'm glad you brought that up.
Definitely Beyond the Pleasure Principle. I have to check the other source for it. It could be in Civilization and Discontent, but it's probably earlier, actually. Anyway, yeah, Freud makes direct references to the Symposium, and Lacan is never necessarily too far away from the ancients, even if Aristotle is generally his interlocutor, like in the ethics seminar, ethics of psychoanalysis seminar. With the Symposium, you can make an easy leap, a direct step to Freud, and then, obviously, as I've mentioned before with the Aristophanes speech, easily make a step to like Seminar 20, like we discussed.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, I think Seminar 20 is almost like this would be an addendum, or like,
it's the discourse on love, right?
The modern interpretation, because of the just Lacan's all discourses are discourses of jouissance, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's the discourse of love, though, right? I mean, or at least the seminar on most directly on love, even if love is kind of in knowledge, the background.
And I think knowledge plays, although it's not in the forefront here, but I think that's the subaltern. I think our knowledge and law are like the repressed topics here to some degree. I mean, they kind of poke through, I think, but
knowledge of the forms in a certain sense with the Socrates and Diotima speech, and it mirrors some of the some of the myth from the Phaedrus. But
I think in terms of the instruction of the young boy or the young man through the older, like the transmission of knowledge and wisdom through that relationship, obviously that's very important for Lacan, right?
To a certain extent, I think that, as you were saying, wisdom and virtue is the particular form of the knowledge that's underway. And insofar as Socrates claims that the art of love is like one of the things he knows best, that puts him kind of in a situation of the psychoanalyst, right? Who is the subject supposed to know with respect to love, which is our fundamentally fucked up, precondition.
All of those other discourses should contribute to love, right? Because that's the kind of thing that is behind the social bond, is right to all of our other discourses, all of our other knowledge, whether it be science, medical, etc., has love as the ultimate expression. Let's say
possible. It depends.
Think about it.
Depends on how we take it.
Think about it in terms of maybe anthropologically or sociologically, right? The whole, like, if you're thinking about, ultimately, why do we want to heal a sick person? Because we care about them, we love them, we don't want to lose that person, right? We want to assuage our losses, or in that sense. But I'm sure there's other better examples, maybe.
For like Socrates and Diotima, it's love that is what giving birth in beauty. It's mediating gods and men. It's that
Right.
drive for immortality. So we can get into some of that. So I think in that sense, perhaps, you could say love is the highest goal, at least from the standpoint of certain aspects of the speeches. But on the other hand, just really quickly, the notion of eros, which is the specific type of love that's in play here. If you look at eros in terms of the Republic, that becomes threatening because eros can lead to a kind of madness. It can be tyrannical. It can lead to instability, not only within the individual, but within the political order. So there's an interesting kind of like tension to the point
It's
of
the
almost
degraded.
contradiction
Yeah.
of from the standpoint of a discourse about the Republic, which is meant for the whole public good, versus these speeches in praise of eros that is held in private by a few chosen individuals who have a kind of prominence in the city. So there is a totally different discourse in Symposium than it's like in the Republic. But in any case, I think we could start with just one of the things that I think kind of gets overlooked sometimes is the preface or the introductory material to the dialogue, because Socrates is not the main interlocutor of the dialogue unless you think his speech in praise of love is the most important, right? He's not the one setting the stage like he will be in a lot of the other ones. We kind of have what is called, we have like a frame within a frame within a frame, right? We have a kind of a nesting egg, a matryoshka doll of dialogues, because it starts with Apollodorus, who has heard the story of Aristodemus, who doesn't give a speech in praise of love, right? Aristodemus is supposedly present at this gathering at the house of Agathon, which is 416 BC. He publishes his first tragedy. It's this big success, and they're celebrating. It's the second night of celebrating the publication of his tragedy. And so the way the story goes is Apollodorus hears it. He had just told it 2 days earlier to someone else, so it's fresh on his mind, and he's telling an unnamed friend about this story that happened supposedly about 10 years prior, presumably right before Alcibiades' death, because Alcibiades was a pretty important political figure of his own. He was a general who had fought for Athens, but also fought for Sparta against Athens, had also fought in Asia Minor for a Persian, general, came back and fought for Athens again, and then had to flee once again, was assassinated. This supposedly happens right before Alcibiades' death, because the interesting thing is why the story about these speeches on love is suddenly so important to be told, that 2 days prior, Apollodorus is telling this businessman who's like wild to hear about it, that Alcibiades was like the talk of the town. He was like Athens, both kind of annoyance and pride and joy, depending on if you were for democracy or for the oligarchy, right? In any case, so this is a kind of a tale told secondhand by someone who heard it from someone else, and the guy who tells it, who's telling the story, right, and Apollodorus, is supposedly with Socrates day in and day out and checking on what Socrates is doing and saying every day. So he's like this devout, fanatical devotee of Socrates. So we can already question an unreliable narrator to a few degrees, not just in terms of his memory and of hearing the story, etc. Because there will be points where he'll be like, I don't remember all the speeches. I'm going to skip over those. I'm going to tell you the best of my memory of what's going on. I've checked with Socrates, and Socrates is the one who's supposed to give the stamp of approval of this is what happened. So that's another unreliability, because do we even trust Socrates?
Right.
And do we trust a fanatic? Do we trust memory? Do we trust Plato staging all of this?
Right.
So we have to already think about this as what's called like metalepsis, right? Where you have frames within a frame,
Plans within plans, man.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
know
we've
what
talked.
that's like. I'm just fucking around with Dune, but
No,
anyways.
you're good. I mean, we've talked about this, like in Heart of Darkness. The story is told by way of Marlowe, but Marlowe's story is told from someone else's mouth. So, like, this is a narrative device that's, as you can see, as old as time, and I doubt
Mhm.
Plato was the first to do it. But that, at least, I think, in my view, makes this, while it is a philosophical dialogue in a sense and should be taken as such, we can't forget that it is a dramatization,
Right.
like any other dialogue, but this one to a heightened degree.
Gotcha.
In any case, right? So Apollodorus is telling the story about Aristodemus, who at the time was supposedly also a kind of a follower of Socrates, which is why he's going around barefoot, meets up with Socrates just at random, and Socrates invites him to this banquet because
Yeah.
Socrates is coming out of the bathhouse because Socrates rarely bathes, right? Because he doesn't give a shit about how he looks, and he's wearing his fancy sandals. Normally, Socrates is going around barefoot, so we know that Socrates is trying to go to this banquet to look his best, right? Which will become important, I think, as we start to discuss beauty.
Yes.
Blah
Yeah.
blah
Yeah.
blah.
Good call. I'm glad I had glossed over that. So hell
No,
yeah,
it's all good, and so
that's perfect. That
you
really
know,
fits into the Keats poem that I wanted to bring up at the end.
yeah. So Aristodemus is he himself mentions in the story, at least as Apollodorus tells it, mentions that he had thought he was the luckiest man in the world, just going from place to place like a vagabond, but realized through philosophy that he was the worst of men, kind of as Apollodorus himself says, right? There's this conversion of Apollodorus to fanatical philosopher and follower of Socrates. Aristodemus is in a very similar position. It's
Mhm.
kind of this cult around Socrates. So Aristodemus goes with Socrates to the banquet, the second night of this celebration for Agathon at Agathon's place. And Agathon is kind of an interesting name because it's kind of like in 18th century novels where you have every man as the character of the novel. Agathon literally it means good man. And so what's interesting though is that there's a slippage between Agathon, good man, and To Agatha, which is the good things, which is what ultimately Socrates will discuss. But in any case, they're all hungover from the night before, right? Because all the people at the banquet are hungover from the night before because they drank. Presumably, the only two who aren't hungover is Aristodemus and Socrates because they only appear on the second night. And it's the doctor, the good doctor, Eryximachus, whose name means fighter of erectations. So he, like, as a doctor, his name is like he fights off belching and burping. He'll provide Aristophanes with a way of curing his hiccups. So I think there's a
Right. Yeah.
play.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Plato is playing off of his name, which would have been easily legible for a Greek.
Mhm.
For us, we have to think about this. And in any case, Eryximachus, the doctor, is like, "Hey, we all drank too much last night. Why don't we take it easy? Why don't we sit around, just hang out, and divert ourselves by giving praise of love?" Right? There's these connections between love and not just Aphrodite, who is obviously the goddess of love, but love insofar as wine. Dionysus,
Oh, right. Right. Right.
is the god of intoxication. Also a god who, while male, is depicted as effeminate, depicted as having female, features, and is presumably love is a type of intoxication, as we
Right.
definitely hear from the Phaedrus. It's a type of intoxication, madness, etc. So they all agree to go in a circle, giving praise to love and giving speeches. And right before this starts, because it starts with Phaedrus, who have brought up the dialogue to, because love will also be, it'll have its own kind of epistemological aspect in the Phaedrus dialogue. I won't talk about that right now, but Phaedrus gives the first speech, and before he does, I think it's important to note that Eryximachus says, let's send away the flute girl who's playing for us, and she can go play for the other women.
For the wives, yeah.
Let's get the women out of the room, just us men. Right. So that sets the stage. I've skipped some details, but I think that kind of sets the stage for the first speech, ending with getting all the women out. And we'll only have a woman come in through myth and through
Dude's night
Socrates'
out.
story. Yeah, dude's night out. So we won't have another woman speak until Socrates, again, frame within a frame, recalls a speech that he heard later. But yeah, so Phaedrus is up first. And I'm going to pause there because I just wanted to set the stage and give you a chance to kind of react to this like opening of the dialogue or whatever strikes your fancy.
I guess I just wanted to preliminarily, just confirm, okay, so it's specific to Eros that this conversation is in that context. Just because I just loosely wanted to point out, I guess, that the Greeks had a few different types of love that they differentiated
At
out,
least three
like
or four.
agape is the universal, phileo, you could probably name the others better.
Philia is kind of a
Philia.
love for an object, you could say.
It's like, what's
It's
philosophy?
more abstract.
That's the philosophy root,
Love of
right?
wisdom.
Love of wisdom, right? Knowledge, etc.
Right. So philia is more of an abstract love. Like we could say I love the cigarette, I mean, what's interesting, you're right about agape. It is seemingly more universal, more sublimated, desexualized, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, exactly.
I do think, though, that what's important about philia and eros is the fact that philia can also refer to what we might consider erotic love. But I think that philia has more overtones of, we could call it, again, it's less concerned with the act, and it's less concerned with the passion. It's really, eros is like passionate, intense love.
Yeah.
And it's usually just dumbed down to sexual relations.
Mm-hmm.
That can be the case, as we see in some of the speeches where, like with Pausanias, there's the heavenly Aphrodite and the earthly Aphrodite. One is more vulgar, one is more just about bodies, one is more just about sex. Sure. But eros isn't just fucking for the sake of fucking. Eros is more passionate, intense, overwhelming, to the point of obsession love.
Yeah, like one would think, being in love, being obsessed. Yeah, love sickness, almost like love sick. I think maybe.
Yeah, I think that's the difference between, even if philia can have aspects of sexuality involved with it, while still remaining philia, it's really that intense, passionate, overwhelming love, which is why I said with the Republic, eros is kind of threatening to the stability of the city. If we're making an ideal city that's supposed to be stable, eros is a threat. Just as Pausanias will say that
feminine jouissance or something like that too, right?
Perhaps. I'm not, it's hard
I'm just
to say
out a little.
Because I think that what's interesting about feminine jouissance is like, in the ecstasy of mysticism, you can see that intense passion,
right?
But it seems like it's an apotheosized, a deified type of love, that
a sublimation.
I mean, I don't even know if sublimation captures it, man. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's the problem there, is that kind of mystical love, or that ecstasy, perhaps can't even be qualified by any of the
right
words.
Well, I mean, that would go back to the feminine jouissance, right? It can't be,
it's ineffable.
Exactly.
So I think it transcends eros in that sense. But in any case, it's great that you pointed out that there are multiple words of love, but in terms of what the love is that they're praising eros, and to the point where Phaedrus will start off with talking about eros as a god. Because there is this sense in which that's an accepted point of view. Obviously there's the goddess of love, Aphrodite, born from, if we recall, Zeus castrates Cronus.
Right.
Oh, wait, is that it? I think so. Zeus castrates Cronus. I'm trying to remember who castrates who. There's a lot of castration involved. Sorry.
On the chopping block.
At least in one of the stories. No, Cronus castrated Uranus. Thank you. I knew I was wrong. Zeus may castrate Cronus, but I don't remember. Zeus may just kill him. So Cronus castrates Uranus, throws his genitals into the Aegean, so to speak. from the foam rises Aphrodite. That's one of the stories of Aphrodite's. So, love is born from castration. Let's just say that
right.
in the
Yeah.
myth.
Well, I mean,
right?
non-relation, maybe.
But also you could see it in, and this is just to anticipate, you could see something similar in Aristophanes' myth where Zeus splits the originally circular perfect
body
humans, the androgynous humans that have both male and female parts, and they're happy and self-sufficient, but they're also terrifying. They're monsters because they can threaten the gods. He castrates them to a certain extent, literally splitting them.
right.
So we can think of this love arises out of this, to speak in Lacanian, terms, right? We have this constitutive lack, blah, blah, blah. We'll get to talk plenty about that. But Aphrodite,
or the originary trauma, if we're going to Freud, right?
Yeah, I mean the
kernel of the traumatic kernel of society or whatever, blah blah blah.
Traumatic kernel of whether it be entering the sphere of the big other, right? I mean that's how Lacan talks about castration. In any case, Aphrodite is the goddess of love. Cupid is normally her son that we think about. Eros is his name in Greek, right? So Eros was a god too, but it's obviously we're talking about when we're giving speeches in praise of love, there will be this splitting between Eros as god, which is why Phaedrus starts off by talking about him, even though he gives a different chronology from Hesiod and not from some other myths where Eros is born of Aphrodite, but then Eros as the passionate love. So there's a slippage between the god and what the god represents. In any case, so Phaedrus starts with the line from Hesiod that's kind of abbreviated because it's not the full line. He leaves some shit out, which doesn't matter, but so there's chaos, then there's earth, which is a seat for all, for the gods and humans and mortals, and then love. And I think what's interesting about this genealogy is the fact that love is not given birth to, is not generated, if you will, just is the principle of Genesis for everything else, including the rest of the gods and such. But you've got three ungenerated principles: chaos, earth, love. And I think that this type of view of the universe is kind of typical of a kind of cyclical eternal return, not the Nietzschean type, but the eternal return of, coming to be and passing away, affecting everything, right? Yeah. And so you start with chaos, you end back with chaos, and the cycle begins again. In any case,
can we label this love? Can we use this as a stand-in for desire itself, or
Well, Diotima will do that. The speech that Socrates gives through Diotima will basically make an equation between love and desire.
Okay.
I think that's implicit in the other speeches.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to, because I think that would be the stepping stone to the psychoanalytic shit that I was reading from.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I think that there's a sense in which it's definitely implicit in the other speeches, even to the point of becoming explicit, but it's very explicit in the logical steps that Diotima leads Socrates through a kind of Socratic dialogue. Socrates himself, it's interesting that Diotima does a kind of Socratic dialogue with Socrates and teaches him this art of love that, in a certain sense, love is directly equated with desire in her dialectic.
Yeah, interesting, because I was thinking more like Spinoza, just because of the ethical component regarding love, and this dialogue or these speeches all kind of, a lot of them are revolving around this question of what are the ethics of love, of eros, etc., right? What are its virtues? What are its, etc., interrogating that idea, right? That's the kind of we're getting from each of these different interlocutors.
You're bringing up when we talked to Michael Hart, and he nicely defined Spinoza's love and joy, right? Joy is an increase in our power to act and to affect and be affected. Love is the recognition of an external cause in which we find joy, in which our power is increased
I mean,
to
I don't
act
know.
and to be acted upon, right? So, I mean,
Yeah.
that's the Spinozist idea of love,
Right.
is this recognition. I think that there's a way in which that can be read. So the ethics of love, this is a great way to lead into Phaedrus, right? Because I think Phaedrus has the most rudimentary and skeletal of the speeches. That's why kind of he starts it out. I won't go into detail about it too much, but one of the things that he kind of points out is that love gives us guidance, because you were kind of talking about love and knowledge earlier. So I think there, in terms of guidance, the guidance is knowledge of what one could say, what leads us to act in such a way as not to shame ourselves or our fellow countrymen, right? Because he says, it's
Dude,
within the
it's like a transference, I think, maybe between, like, it's almost a transferential relation between the younger man and the older man in the love relationship. Like,
yes,
the older man instructs the younger man in terms of how to navigate and be a part of the social link or something like that, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
the
And
proper forms of expression of the forms, to make a little platonic joke there.
right. I
Go
mean,
ahead.
I think that you're exactly right. Understanding transference loosely, yes. If the older male with a younger male is sort of love in the sense of
Well,
a mentorship, right? Because you're
I just
trying
see
to
this.
instruct the ways of acting in a way that conducts with virtue. Yeah,
I was thinking of this as in a way to deal with Oedipus in a similar fashion to, I forget which culture we discussed a while back regarding, like, where the maternal uncle would act as the father figure for the young man. Because they're excluded from the sexual relationship between the mother and father, like, it removes that animus of the animosity between and the threat of the son.
yeah.
Or something like that, or like the
That's
resentment of the father by the son, like, it breaks that, because the older man that's teaching you, like, they're kind of acting as a surrogate, a semblance of the father, a degraded form of the father that, I don't know, kind of fucks with the whole power relationship, the double bind of the Oedipus. But I don't.
that was an anti-Oedipus when they're discussing Levi-Strauss, analysis of kinship structures. And you're right, it's the maternal uncle who takes on this interesting role, we could say, of mentor without any of the baggage of a father-son,
Right. Yeah.
father-daughter
Exactly.
relationship. And this is why also it's kind of almost ritualistic for there to be these thefts from the maternal uncle.
It would even
And
go to, like, whenever we spoke with Daniel Tutt, he was kind of talking about these different. You find this surrogate father, right, in the social. Like, we all have to kind of find this
right,
surrogate father figure that allows
right.
us to work through Oedipus or whatever. I think maybe that's kind of what the logic, perhaps from like the standpoint of the socius or something like that. If we're looking down from that level, you can kind of see the sociological or anthropological methodology being utilized here, or like the
I mean,
logic driving it.
I think you're
I
very
interrupted you.
much no, you're very much correct in how Phaedrus is setting it up, and you're right. It is a kind of working through of the Oedipus complex indirectly, right? Because as he says, love gives us guidance. It gives us a sense of shame in acting shameful, and a sense of pride in acting well. And this is in relation to the lover, to the older man, in relation to the younger man. So the older man is mentoring and teaching these principles of virtue and how to act correctly, then it's also, as you said, transference or in the counter transference. But with the older man in the presence of the younger man, he's not going to act shamefully. That would be worse than acting shamefully in front of his friends or even his family, as he says. And he's going to conduct himself with pride and take pride by acting well and by acting virtuously in front of the younger man.
Yeah, he
And
takes on the position of the master.
in a loose sense, not in a bad
Well, I'm
sense.
just thinking, no, I mean, like, even in the sense of, like, the analytic session or whatever, right? Like how Lacan kind of, I mean, he puts on the hat of the master, but it's not like it's a simulacrum or whatever.
I would say the subject's supposed to know rather,
Right?
but
Yeah,
that's a
sure.
kind of a way of saying what you're saying. And I think that that's why Socrates is such an interesting figure to anticipate, or just to put it out there right now, is
Right.
because
Yeah.
Socrates is always going to claim he knows that he knows nothing. So he's the subject supposed to know that he doesn't know. So yeah, but back to
His
Frederick
tie to the feminist jouissance too, and like the thread of that, I think, is one too that I want to emphasize later on.
I think that Phaedrus, so love gives guidance, right? So it instills virtues. And this is why he says an army or city made of lovers and the boys they love would be the best possible system of society, right? Because they would not act shamefully in front of their beloved. They would take pride in acting well. And he even kind of says, no one will die for you but a lover, even if she's a woman, as he says, right? Which is as a nice dig at the feminine, as we'll see in these first three speeches. There is this, we could call it misogynistic. I think it's a literal type of phallocentrism, because it is trying to elevate the love between a man and a boy, this relationship. And it really, boy isn't a good translation. It's a young man, right? It's the pederasty is definitely, even Pausanias says that before they have hairs on their chin, they shouldn't be taken as a lover, because they can be led astray and seduced and taken advantage of. Just putting that out there, as because this is going to recur throughout this dialogue. And if we try to ignore that, I think we do a disservice to what's going on, and it's not truthful. So I think that those are the main things, for Phaedrus, the ideal city, if such a thing could exist without the reproductive capacities of woman, which is interesting that it's taken for granted, as we've discussed a lot on this show, not just with Thomas Nail or in terms of Baudrillard, but taking for granted the reproductive capacities. If somehow men could give birth, then for Phaedrus, the ideal city would be young men, or men and their young men lovers. They would die for each other. It's the esprit de corps that we've talked about, right? It's that would be an unshakable bond, and in a certain sense, because it would keep everybody in check. It would be so that everyone would be acting as honorably as possible,
Right.
Precisely because love inspires them.
Which is the whole point of, I mean, this is what coding, I think, right? Like, this is social coding.
That's an interesting way of putting it. Do you want to say a word or two more?
Just in terms of the social bond or the social relation between individuals that are not in a familial, that don't share blood ties, right? Like, how do we create a society where strangers can love one another as though they are family, which would be a type of communism, right? Like, that would be the social relation where I love you as my brother, but we're not brothers, at least not in that sense, right?
Yeah,
so I think that's where trying to regulate society in this way where there is this emphasis on the bond between individuals that are not tied in this familial relation, I guess. Yeah. Really all I kind of wanted to say was, like, again, I'm thinking about this from like a sociological or anthropological perspective. The libidinal band, the Greek society as a whole, the libidinal economics of it, how are these ethical questions and etc. Like, that's what this is really about, right? Is this discourse of ethics, love, truth, beauty, and knowledge, I think, are all involved here. So I just wanted to emphasize that a little.
To get back to your point about coding the flows of desires, I suppose it's hard to call it that except in a more literal sense, because it would be a kind of a way in which love would, well, I guess it works. I mean, it'd be a way in which love would inspire a code of honor, if you will, for libidinal economy. There's a sense of almost like a samurai code or some shit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, for sure.
It's kind of a Bushido type thing where there is this there is this like honor code that naturally develops, quote unquote, naturally develops in this ideal society that Phaedrus is imagining. So yeah, I mean, I think that's mostly Phaedrus's speech.
To me, what's interesting is how the reverse of this seems to be more prominent, right? Like, a lot of times, like in our modern myth or whatever, like, love is the death of duty, whereas here love is the is the bond. Love creates a sense of duty to your dutiful.
Yes.
I'm dutiful to my compatriot because they will protect me and I will protect them. And like if I let them down, etc.
I think you're definitely right. That's a good point to make, that in Phaedrus' idealized society without any of the women, there's this sense in which love inspires and gives birth to duty. And it is one and the same with duty. You can't even really like separate it, because the feeling of being seen acting shamefully by your beloved would be enough to deter and dissuade you from acting poorly. I mean, I think that that's definitely right.
Since we're on this topic of esprit de corps and I guess the martial relationship between soldiers, etc., I just want to read this from God Emperor of Dune, because in contrast to this notion where it's like the all male force that are all in love with one and each other would be the most effective fighting force. This is like going against the grain, that grain, and saying no, well, it's an all female force would not have like, I guess, the tendencies to rape and destroy. You know what I mean? So it's kind of the reverse with regard to like this chaotic capacity of desire or madness, or like being at the edge of that state of like an ecstatic state, being at that edge, right? Because cities being sacked, violence and sex, eros and thanatos are closely aligned, let's say, at least historically, when it comes to the sacking of cities. But anyways, let me read this. The Duncans always think it odd that I choose women for combat forces, but my fish speakers are a temporary army in every sense. While they can be violent and vicious, women are profoundly different from men in their dedication to battle. The cradle of Genesis ultimately predisposes them to behavior more protective of life. They have proved to be the best keepers of the golden path. I reinforce this in my design for their training. They are set aside for a time from ordinary routines. I give them special sharings, which they can look back upon with pleasure for the rest of their lives. They come of age in the company of their sisters in preparation for events more profound. What you share in such companionship always prepares you for greater things. The haze of nostalgia covers their days among their sisters, making those days into something different than they are. That's the way today changes history. All contemporaries do not inhabit the same time. The past is always changing, but few realize it.
The future Bene Gesserit army is the analogy.
I mean, it's almost like Herbert does the reverse, and he does an essentialism of obviously women being tied to the nature, right, and like men being tied to violence. So he's falling back on like a kind of modern chauvinism, I guess, in a
Sure.
sense. But I mean, yeah, it's kind of this interesting dialectic, I guess, between the chaotic. Well, here the man is chaos and the woman is order. But I think for the Greeks, it seems like it's the reverse.
For Phaedrus,
Who does Socrates go to? He doesn't go to a man to learn the knowledge of love. He doesn't preach it himself. Originarily, he obtains it in his discourse with Diotima. It's something that he lacks as a man. He lacks the mystical knowledge or whatever of the. I mean, I think that there's a problematic with that way of framing things, is what I'm saying, too, on both counts.
Yeah, I mean, it contrasts starkly with Phaedrus's, and with, as we'll see, Pausanias and Eryximachus, who all kind of praise male-male relations as this ideal and nobler form of love. And so I think Socrates, and this is Plato's irony, right? You know, turns on its head where Socrates, if he's supposed to be the sort of master in the arts of love, where he learns his knowledge, right? He learns it from this priestess. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's part of the irony, I think, at work. And I think that's why Aristophanes has to be a transitional figure, and why he also doesn't get to take his turn. His turn is taken due to a bodily necessity that separates him from the first three speakers.
Because he's the one that hiccups, right?
Yeah, he's the one that hiccups. He's going to be separated from the first three speakers, who are going to focus purely on this male-centric love. And Aristophanes will be a transitional figure where we get the androgynous figure and the sort of pre-established harmony stuff. But I guess, really quickly, before we get to Aristophanes, because I won't have too much to say on Eryximachus. I think he's the one made fun of the most by Plato. That's just my reading. But Pausanias is a very interesting figure after Phaedrus, And, he wants to give, as I mentioned earlier, maybe before we started recording, he wants to give these self-serving reasonings for why, pederasty should be looked upon as the highest goal. With Pausanias, he wants to separate the two Aphrodites, because in his story, Eros takes either Aphrodite, the heavenly Aphrodite, which is kind of purely male and older. That's kind of an Eros that's a love of the soul, versus this other Aphrodite, the common, vulgar, earthly Aphrodite, that is basically for merely getting the sexual act done, in the sense in which it's part female, right? And this is why it's more vulgar. I think I mentioned to you this is kind of like an antinatalist point of view, but in any case, I think that without really even going too deeply into Pausanias, because some of it is just not as interesting, except for maybe the 6 aspects of love in a cultured society. I don't know. We could talk about Pausanias a little bit. I think he's interesting for certain reasons. But, I will say, before diving into it, and then I'll throw it back to you before we kind of talk about some of these aspects. What's funny to me is, since you brought up psychoanalysis, I was thinking, if heavenly Aphrodite is purely male and it's meant to not be centered around sex and sexual intercourse, it's meant to be this elevation of souls, kind of like what Phaedrus was talking about, right? What's humorous to me is that Pausanias makes sexual procreation for the purposes of reproduction the perverse thing. Whereas when Freud is kind of going through the 3 essays on sexuality, his way of talking about the normal point of view is that anything that doesn't lead directly to sex for procreation is perverse. So there's a complete shift with Pausanias, where actually it's sexual procreation, it's sex for sexual procreation that is the perverse thing.
This makes sense, because I said this in the episode on the 3 essays on sex, because due to the lack of teleos in the homosexual relationship in terms of offspring, since there is no logical purpose, there is no ultimate end to it. It is based on a pure love that transcends a physical desire for immortality, right? There's a finitude to the relation, and finitude is what makes things beautiful, right? If, in a sense, that's what imbues a certain whatever, like, creativity into the human, is its mortality. Whereas the gods don't have, mutability, right? Gods cannot change. Superman can't grow or change, because Superman is already Superman. It's not interesting. It's boring whenever someone is an eternal form, right?
Well,
This is what gives life its sort of joie de vivre.
It's probably debatable about the Greek gods whether or not they have changing characteristics, but for the most part, you're right. They're more permanent, more eternal, etc. So, I mean, I think that one of the first things that pops out for me with Pausanias's defense of pederasty, as I mentioned again before the show started, he has an extreme view of male-centered relations, where he even says it should be allowed for men to marry other men. I will just say, like, this is not, even if the Greeks, and this dialogue shows it, had and allowed, and even, to use your word again, celebrated pederasty, male-male relations, for the most part, as we've talked about, this was about an active passive relationship where a young man is being raised up and mentored, almost initiated into polite society, being taught virtuous actions, blah, blah, blah. And so this idea that older men together would be something common or celebrated, that's not necessarily true. There were sanctions against it, somewhat harsh sometimes.
Mhm.
Obviously, it wasn't universally applied in
Right.
every case, but it's kind of assumed that when you become a full participating adult in Greek society, let's say, a citizen in the restricted sense of male landowning,
Mhm.
etc., which is generally in your 30s or whatever, you're supposed to then take on your younger teenage male and raise them up. You're not necessarily supposed to, well, obviously you wouldn't have homosexual male relation marriage, but Pausanias is the one who's kind of saying like, man, we have to marry women, for these customs of sexual reproduction. Isn't this kind of a debasing of true love, which is a love of the soul, not of the body,
Not of the body. Yeah.
etc.
It's not a jouissance of the organ.
So in a certain sense, there are certain kernels of Pausanias's argument that we'll see in something like Socrates, for example, right? Which is, again, about a love of the soul, or
in
really
itself, for
it's not,
itself.
but it's not even any particular soul, right? It's the love of the forms, which is kind of, but in any case, there are kernels of, I think, each speech that we can see in either Plato's, if we give him one doctrine of love, Plato's view, or Socrates's, the higher dialectic. But in any case, one of the things that I find interesting is, after talking about common Afro, vulgar Afro, which is love between male and women, or male and male indifferently, right? It's just about doing the sexual act. And then heavily Aphrodite, which is purely male. He makes this point about, as I mentioned, that good men restrain themselves without the need for laws from taking advantage of young boys. And here I think it's specific prepubescent boys who are pederasty as we think of it in layman's terms today, not in the kind of sense I've been saying it earlier, male-male relations, male to younger men relationship. I mean, we're talking about ephebophilia or whatever, right? He's saying that's bad. Even Pausanias has limits. He's saying that's bad. And good men restrain themselves without laws, but we have these laws to keep the bad men, to keep vile men from taking advantage of boys before they come of age, let's say. They need this external restraint. And I think for him, this is a good thing. You might think Pausanias with his unrestrained, I mean, he has some restraints and some limits. But in a certain sense, his arguments about these laws being a good thing is also for the fact that, his argument is that young men, and again, young men coming of age, should resist as much as possible any man unless they can be taught virtue, unless they can become a better man, let's say, right? And for him, the main criterion for this is logical argumentation. It's not how rich your suitor is. It's not how beautiful he is, etc. It's how, kind of like how well spoken he is, like a sophist.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that this was self-serving.
Which is where the irony comes in with Socrates, because I think Alcibiades even specifically calls him out on.
Calls him a sophist. Yeah. You're right.
Well, does he? I just remember that he specifically. I remember there's something about irony that I pulled. If I need to,
he calls him a sophist. Yeah, he talks about his sophistry, which we'll get to in a little bit. Okay, so we go from this about these external laws, right? And his way of seeing it is that the man with the best words should be the best suitor, and I think that's self-serving because he doesn't have riches, he doesn't have good looks, etc. He's kind of promoting himself as the best suitor. In any case, then he makes this kind of interesting, we could call it xenophobic statement about where he says, it is not shameful for people in these other countries. He mentions Elis and Boeotia, right? These who would be considered quote unquote barbaric cultures, these other cultures. It's not shameful for them to take any lover because they're inarticulate. They don't use the logos to inspire, to seduce, or to entice. Because they're more animalistic, they can fuck whoever they want. It's not shameful. They don't have proper manners and culture.
right?
And he wants to suggest that unlike us in Athens, where we're more cultured and we have these restrictions and we know it's shameful to take any lover and there should be these limits and these laws, there should be, it should be shameful for a young man to fall for an older man because, say, they have money, because then that just makes them a whore. It's shameful in our culture because we're about bettering ourselves, blah, 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 whatever. So it's a very kind of, again, it's self-centered in a collective sense now. And as I said, it's a little bit racist. It's not his main point. I think it's more of aggrandizing Athens than necessarily shitting on others, but there's a kernel of that, right? But one of the things that I found, and I have this passage here that I had marked out, where I find his equation of the things that make us better, that better us as people, and that make us strive for higher things. I feel like this is the best part of his speech. This is followed after this kind of xenophobic stuff about the other cultures. It's not shameful for them to take any lover because they don't really use the logos. They're inarticulate. Right. They're more animalistic. So he says, by contrast, in places like Ionia and almost every other part of the Persian Empire, taking the lover is always considered disgraceful. The Persian Empire is, now that's interesting. Taking the lover, this is the different part. In places where there are absolute power reigns. So in these other countries like Boeotia, it's not shameful to take a lover because they have more of, like, let's say, a tribal type of power structure. Power is decentered. It's not centered. It's not absolute. And they don't have logos. They don't have culture. But in places that impose absolutely, like the Persian Empire, he says, taking the lover is always considered disgraceful. So it's the opposite. The Persian Empire is absolute. That's why it condemns love as well as philosophy and sport. It is no good for rulers that the people they rule cherish ambitions for themselves or form strong bonds of friendship with one another. That these are precisely the effects of philosophy, sport, and especially of love, is a lesson the tyrants of Athens learned directly from their own experience. Then their reign come to a dismal end because of the bonds uniting Harmodius and Aristogonon in love and affection.
This is where sublimation as a political force comes into play. Just to flag that. I didn't know if you had more to read.
No, yeah. And then the last thing he says is, so you can see that plain condemnation of love reveals lust for power in the rulers and cowardice in the ruled, while indiscriminate approval testifies to general dullness and stupidity. So you've got in the two extremes, under tyranny, it's always shameful to pursue love, philosophy, or sport because that emboldens us to aspire higher and to achieve higher ambitions. And so it's a threat, right? And then indiscriminate approval of love in any case, like the common Aphrodite that he's disparaging, which includes men loving women, which includes all heterosexual relations in an interesting way, right? That's dullness and stupidity. So between those two extremes, taking no lover, taking any lover, there is the kind of narrow path of Athens, Athenian
the golden
democracy.
Path of
yeah, the golden path of Athenian democracy, where the best spoken, the most well argued, the sophists will be the alpha males. And this is the 6 aspects that characterize Athens, the golden mean, the middle way, where there should be harsh restrictions on the beloved, allowing pursuit, and harsh restrictions on the and no restrictions on the lover pursuing, right? Because you need to have like this buffer, this obstacle to overcome in a certain sense. He says the 6 aspects of love in a culture, society: honor. It's kind of like Phaedrus. It makes us avoid shame and pursue good actions. Honesty and openness, right? Instead of skulking around and keeping love to yourself and in secret and repressing it, you're able to express your love. It encouraged extraordinary acts. Love redeems what should be shamed. And here he's talking about the lover pursuing the beloved. It endows us with nobility, and the gods grant lovers immense freedom, right? All of these things. But again, if you think about it, his speech is supposed to praise love when actually his speech is praising the lover, the specific type of lover that he happens to be. So again, it's self-serving. And his main point, if there is a telos, so this is the interesting thing. This gets us back to what you were saying. When you were saying there's something pure about homosexual relations because they aren't subjected to the telos of sexual reproduction, which I think is a brilliant point.
Yeah, there's no predetermined outcome or even like potential for one other than love.
I think that for Pausanias, he agrees, except that he substitutes a different telos. The teleology of Pausanias would be the only justification for subjecting oneself. The telos, the higher goal, would be for the sake of virtue, for the sake of producing virtue. So you can see that Pausanias and Phaedrus definitely overlap in certain of their principles. Pausanias kind of fleshes out Phaedrus's ideas a little bit more,
I
but
hope you said
also
flesh on purpose.
exactly. So young men should only accept lovers so as to be taught wisdom and virtue. Any other reason is shameful. If it's for beauty, if it's for lust,
If it's for a jouissance of the body,
if it's for the
bad.
jouissance of the organ, yeah. If it's for money, especially, because there's a way in which, again, this is self-serving for Pausanias, but it also, I think, is true in a general sense that if the richest are the ones that get the most because they can lavish them with gifts they bought with money, obviously then Pausanias is going to be low on the totem pole. In a more general sense, I think that it's not just self-serving. I think there's a kernel of truth in it that we would agree with, right? That marrying for money, and I'm not, we have terms like gold digger and stuff like this, which can be men or women, even though usually it's applied misogynistically.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that's looked down upon. I'm not going to necessarily judge anyone on that. And in the old days, individuals wouldn't even have the say. A lot of times it would be alliances made between families. And a lot of times those alliances are trying to not just they're considering all the benefits, including financial ones.
Correct.
But also honor, prestige.
Yeah. Those things are all like,
nobility.
it's almost like there's, well,
they're part of the same economy.
Yeah, for sure. It's like this match has, well, the name is not quite so good, but they're rich, or like this is an old historic family. The name is whatever we might accept, a little bit smaller dowry, etc.
Yeah, so I would say that in a certain sense, Pausanias is definitely right to single out virtue and wisdom as ennobling reasons for subjecting oneself to love. But again, he's giving a discourse on the lover and what makes the like appropriate lover and the beloved. He's not really, in a certain sense, some of the speech, but most of it is not about love. But I think that's what makes Pausanias so interesting, and especially the hardcore, women have cooties type of thing, right? He's like, ooh, gross, like I hate that we have to marry women to have babies. That's disgusting. Any thoughts or replies more on his speech?
I don't think so, but I didn't quite note mine out by speaker as much as theme. So
No, I get it, and I think the themes will. We can
think I
definitely
was
talk about the broader themes. I think it's just what makes this dialogue a little bit more needing to go in chronological order is trying to hit each speaker and give them a say. So next up is supposed to be Aristophanes. We mentioned earlier Aristophanes has the hiccups, right? He has a due to bodily necessity he can't speak.
Aristophanes is a comedian by trade, right? Or at least in terms of his work. Am I right there?
Yes, he's
He's
a
a
writer
poet?
he's a writer of comedies and a
Okay.
poet. So if you contrast Agathon, who we're going to hear after Aristophanes, Agathon is the guy who published his first tragedy and may or may not have existed. The main source for his existence is this dialogue, but he's the host of the banquet, right? He's everybody's there to party and celebrate with Agathon for the publication of a tragedy.
Right.
So Agathon is the tragic poet, and Aristophanes is the comedian, is the comic poet, and that's going to become important later. So Aristophanes is supposed to go next. He has the hiccups and says, Ximachus, why don't you go next? And Ximachus is like, well, by the time I'm done with the speech, maybe you'll be cured of your hiccups. Why don't you hold your breath? Or if that doesn't work, he has something else.
It has him try to sneeze or something, I think.
He says, tickle your nose with a feather and sneeze. And that cures him of his hiccups, as we learn when Aristophanes speaks. But first is Ximachus, and he is, if you think about it as 6 speeches plus Alcibiades at the end, he is going to be at the end of the kind of male-dominated speeches. But his is unique in a certain way, because he's going to be like the speaker, because he's a medical doctor. He's going to be, let's call him the speaker of pure technics. He's the guy that is going to be given technicism, if you will, its due, its center. As I said, I think Eryximachus is being mocked pretty heavily by Plato because, for Plato, to a certain extent, there is some hostility to medicine. And I'll try to just briefly state this without going into it because there's a whole genre of literature on this. The main point being is that the reason why medicine is frowned upon by Plato is the fact that if philosophy is, let's call it the doctrine or discourse about living well, right? The unexamined life is not worth living, as Socrates will say in in one of the last dialogues. So philosophy is about living well. Medicine is, and this applies to the human body, but also to the political body as well, because we can think about philosophy as political. If love on the political level is like justice in the Platonic conception, right? So philosophy is about sort of assuring harmony through justice, whereas medicine is about living at all costs. It's not about living well. It's about not dying. And I think that is a kind of perversion or even inversion of philosophy's goals. So once medicine is applied to the individual body or the political body, and that is the sole means of and method of surviving, then I think it's to be frowned upon. I know this seems very strange to our point of view, where we have all these miracles of modern medicine, blah, 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 even though we could talk about healthcare in America, et cetera. That kind of gets us off course. But Plato's point kind of being, if medicine is reduced to the art of merely living for living another day, then it is bad.
It's this dialectic between the ideal and the expressed or whatever, to some degree, I think, is undergirding the critique here.
That's definitely
seems to be underneath a lot of this, is that the ideal is divine and the body is weak and disgusting. All the deficiencies are in the body versus the ideal. The ideal is the prop for we're degraded expressions of the divine or whatever.
Or you mean the body is the prop? Is that what you're saying? Like,
no, the divine is the divine is
the body is just the means to the end, right? For the ideal, or
right?
something?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
it's
gotcha.
Going back to the example of the love, like it's totally metaphysical.
Let's not disparage the body completely. We will need bodies when we get to Diotima's speech. For the most part, I think you're right. There is this sense in which philosophy treats the soul.
Well, I mean,
medicine treats the body. But I do think we will have need of bodies. So let's not completely get rid of the body just yet.
Well, I just think like the underlying argument or like the underlying binary logic I'm seeing under the text, the subtext, is that a lot of these comparisons are drawing this body bad, ideal good, or like form good, body bad.
You're exactly right. We saw this with Pausanias, and I think we see on the opposite side with Eryximachus, because he's kind of a physicalist, he's a technician of the body, right? The doctor. I think that in that sense, yes, you're right. There is a sense in which if medicine only treats the body just to keep the body going, rather than to elevate the body, that's the problem. Because
to sublimate the body.
As we'll see with Diotima, the body is a necessary step along the ascent to the forms. So it's not bad in and of itself. It's just bad if we stay on that level.
Sure.
So
that makes sense.
So one of the cool things, Eryximachus, just the big broad points I picked out from him. Love occurs beyond the human domain and below in animals, plants, and gods everywhere in the universe. This is very kind of similar to
the social's already invested by desire. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I mean,
but not really. I'm kidding to hedge my bets.
Desire is cosmic. I mean, there's some sense in which Deleuze and Guattari do kind of make some of these claims about desiring machines extending. If humans are the custodians of the machines of the universe, there is a sense in which it's like trying to connect desiring machines back to this cosmic ebb and flow.
Through the body without organs,
there's something similar going on there. But I think it goes back to the eternal return in the Platonic sense that I was talking about, of the cycle, the physical cycle of from chaos to the ordered universe and back. And I think Eryximachus and Phaedrus are one of the same on that instance. So what I was thinking too was about the fact that if love is universal and is cosmic, which sounds very nice and new agey to a certain extent, it's very similar to the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles, who talked about cosmogenesis in terms of cycles of love and wrath. Love being kind of the expansion and complexification and unification, wrath being the destruction and separation and division, right? And so you can kind of see that in how Freud tries to formulate Eros and Thanatos and beyond the pleasure principle, right? Eros is about combining these larger units. Thanatos is breaking them back down, right? So you can kind of see in Eryximachus a seed planted by Empedocles with this cosmic,
or even
this cosmic dialectic of love and wrath. Yeah, go ahead.
Or even to like go the dialectic between the drive and desire. Okay, not the drive and desire per se, but like the preservative drives and the death drive.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I love the way that Samo described the death drive as this thing within the organism that wants to live irregardless of the self-preservative drive. So in excess of the self, something that exceeds even the
it's the undead drive. It's the undead drive, right?
Yeah, life that exceeds life.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and you're definitely right. So for Eryximachus, love is judged on the basis of the body and what promotes health. But here we have to again assert that for Eryximachus, he's a technician of the body, and so health in his sense would be, I think, contrasted with living well in philosophy sense. So we should kind of,
we'd almost have to bring in Foucault here. I wish I had thought about that. Might have been a little
can't do everything. Can't do everything.
Right?
Yeah. Quote, medicine is simply the science of the effects of love on repletion and depletion of the body, which is just a kind of laughable definition, I think, for Plato. The physician's job is to distinguish love that is noble from love that is ugly and disgraceful. We saw that in Phaedrus. We saw that in Pausanias, right? Two kinds of love: the icky love between a man and a woman for babies or for households, and kind of pure noble love between a man and his younger lover. And I said, notice Plato's mocking the speaker a good deal. Everything is a science of love. That's basically how I summed up reading his speech, where everything, any poiesis, right? Because in Greek, even if poetry is the whole from which everything is a part, because poetry in Greek is creation, but it's specifically referring to writers, right? Like tragedians and comedians, the lyric poets. But everything else is considered a poiesis. Any type of creation is a poiesis. It's just interesting that poetry as a part stands for the whole, right? In the synecdoche type of metonymy type of sense. Eryximachus is kind of a poetaster, right? A bad poet of love. He's making everything into this techniques of love, whether it be physician is looking at the love of the body with itself or some shit, right? He's just basically, I think, serving as irony, an ironic point. There's obviously a lot more we could go into with Eryximachus, but we can go on from him. So he cures Aristophanes of his hiccups with the feather trick, and with Aristophanes, we get a myth. And now, Aristophanes is like, I'm going to tell the story. You might see it as I'm just making jokes, right? Because I'm the comedian, so you might laugh at me. But he's like, I'm trying to do justice to what we're doing here. We're trying to give praise of love. I'm going to tell the story about how I see Eros, how I see love, and it'll tell us something about ourselves through myth. And it's not meant to be funny. If it makes you laugh, all the better, but take me seriously. We've talked about this in other places, so I'll try to be quick, but we can discuss a little bit of it. He tells the story about the fact that the first humans, you had males, you had females, but you also had androgynous beings in the literal sense, where they had 4 arms, 4 legs, both sets of genitals, male and female, in this kind of circular whole, this spherical, self-sufficient whole. And the way they would move would be by kind of doing handsprings, by doing, what do they call it?
Cartwheels. Like a
Cartwheels.
cartwheel.
They'd move doing cartwheels. Now it's interesting with someone like Aristotle, the sphere as self-sufficient would have no need to move, because if it's in its perfection, it would be
Right. Yeah.
motionless. But in any case, I think there's this tension between
Yeah.
the self-sufficiency of the whole, of the one, of this harmonious one, of the sexual relationship existing in the past
Yeah. Very good.
versus, and because for Aristophanes in the past there was a sexual relationship that
now there
made,
is a cut. There is a gap.
right.
There's a chasm. There's a void.
So
There's
if there,
chaos.
if there was a sexual relationship in the past, in this Edenic past, let's say, right? Because it's kind of an Adam and Eve type analogy, not exactly the same, but
Right.
there is hubris in both cases, right? If the hubris was eating from the tree, which we talked about, the hubris of the androgynous spherical humans was to kind of challenge the gods, let's say, challenge Zeus for supremacy. And Zeus is like, well, we could kill all the humans, but we kind of like them worshiping us, which obviously begs the question whether or not they have become addicted to this worship, or whether or not they require the worship to continue existing and draw their
Right.
power.
Yeah.
I think
Which makes sense in the context of the spooks, or like the critique of religion from Marx, right? Like,
that's good. Yeah, you're bringing up Stirner here. There's a sense in which those phantasms, those spooks, the religious transcendence, they feed off of our
the
belief.
transcendental signifiers, etc.
They feed off our belief. So there's a sense in which they draw this power. So Zeus is like, well,
The emperor has no clothes, right? It's like the hysterics discourse.
yeah,
But sorry.
exactly. No, you're right. You're right. There is the sense, and so Zeus is like, well, I don't want to get rid of all of them. And he like racks his brain, and there's almost this, it's kind of a comic thing seeing Zeus being like, I don't know what the fuck to do.
It's fucking
And so he's
Solomon
like,
logic too.
yeah, so he's like, we're gonna split them. We're gonna split them all down the middle. They'll be less powerful. They'll have to find their other half if they can, because it's not guaranteed. So he splits them down. Now, it's funny that Zeus is, we have these stories within a story. So Aristophanes tells another story, a myth. In the myth, he tells a story about Zeus talking to Apollo, because it's Apollo who he talks to. And if you remember, Apollo is the god of medicine. So it's interesting that he's also the god of music.
God of reason?
Prophecy.
I mean, you always hear Apollo and Dionysus contrasted.
Apollo's a god of a lot of things, including archery, music. I suppose you could add reason, but generally prophecy, right? Which is why you have an oracle to Apollo at Delphi.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
Makes sense. In any case, he's telling this story to Apollo. He's telling this idea. Apollo, I got this idea. Why don't I cut them in half? They'll be less powerful without their other half. So he cuts them in half, and he has Apollo sew them back up. It's very important that we think Apollo applying the medicine sews them back up.
The signifier.
Our navel is supposed to be the remnant of this cut.
Yeah.
Which, as we know,
I mean, you can kind of see the penis and the vagina and the breasts.
It's cutting, but it's the umbilical cord, right?
Yeah,
like it's the wholeness of
because the
child
in
the womb,
right?
Yeah,
which is almost like a physical circle. Yeah, you can very easily jump from that.
And it goes back to the appropriating of the metaphor of sexual reproduction for the purposes of the speeches in this dialogue. That's what we're going to see over and over. We already saw it with Pausanias, but rejecting it with Socrates and Diotima, it'll be elevated to a trope. But in any case, yes, if anything, we're cut from the womb. So Apollo sews them up, and they go from being monsters, which I have a quote here. I have a fulfillment of Eros would lead to a race of monsters. So the existence of the sexual relationship is the monstrous, terrifying to gods, androgynous spherical beings. In any case, they're sewn up after being cut in half. And Zeus does say, and if they keep fucking around, we'll cut them in half again, and then they'll hop around on one leg. In any case, their genitals are on their outside, so they try to hug and embrace each other. but the man is, coming on the ground instead of inside the woman. So Zeus takes pity on them because they're so pathetic, and he turns their genitals to the right side. And that's this story about, what is it? I have here Aristophanes quote, "Love is born into every human being to make one out of two and heal the wound of human nature." And of course, I only put anti-Lacanian here because it's very close to this Lacanian discourse that we just read on Seminar 20, except with Lacan, he is wanting us to keep in abeyance, to literally like hold at arm's length this fantasy of wholeness, of making one out of two.
Yeah.
Which it's important that we have to see Aristophanes' myth for what it is. If we see it as a myth that it is, then it may be closer to the Lacanian perspective. If we see it as a fantasy that doesn't recognize itself as fantasy, then I think it's anti-Lacanian, or then it falls back into a kind of nostalgia type of thing, which I think it's supposed to evoke in us, but also we're supposed to expel.
Yeah, it's almost like a forgotten knowledge of. I was going to draw like a crazy comparison to like someone has to play God, but in so doing, like the social aspect of that is erased, or the relational aspect, and then it's like, oh, the divine right of kings, etc.
Yeah, I mean,
but that's a little bit taking
it's
a kind of a leap there.
It is interesting that,
just to clarify, something like the emperor having no clothes, right? It's this idea that wards off the actual, like it's this fantastic barrier that prevents or wards off, in a sense, revolution or change, etc. Like it's the resistance. Yeah, resistance.
if you rise against Daddy Zeus, you'll be castrated. That's very directly kind of Freud's idea of castration, where
Okay, gotcha.
it's the threat that the father imposes on the child because the child is desiring the primordial loved object of the mother, and the father has to lay down the law, threaten you with castration unless you get over your Oedipus complex. Now, obviously, Lacan transfers this to the realm of language and debiologizes it. It's not about losing the narcissism of pride in our male member, that this is a constitutive thing of entering the realm of language and, becoming sort of battered by the chain of signifiers, etc. I will say two more things about Aristophanes. One, he brings up the Hephaestus analogy, where he says Hephaestus comes to two lovers and is like, wouldn't you want more than anything that I just weld you back up, into your primordial whole? Because it's obvious that it's not sex that you want, and that's not what extinguishes desire, isn't it? Don't you need a technician to weld you back up? If Zeus cut you and then you were sewn back up, don't you need the god of technics to weld you back together? And wouldn't that be what you want? And it comes to be that Aristophanes, the truth of Aristophanes, as I get it, which I take a Lacanian way of reading it, is that love is not about sex, but something that cannot be said, like an oracle hides behind a riddle. So there is this sense in which, if love is not about fucking, and this is kind of the Hephaestus analogy that he gives, like he's asking the lovers, what do you want? And they're like, it's hard not to say. But Aristophanes suggests maybe what they want, and wouldn't it be great if they were welded back together? So when they die for all eternity, even in Hades, they're with their other half. So this desire for wholeness perhaps can't be put into words, but I think can be framed, like the framing of fantasy, right? Because that's essentially what it is. I do want to get to Socrates because we have been talking for a little while. Agathon gives his speech. It ends up being basically this poetic thing. I mean, he doesn't really say anything much new. He makes some nuances. For sake of time, I will just say, he ends his speech with this poetic flourish, and the crowd cheers him. Not just for the poetry, which I think is implied, but because he's the guest, or he's the host. He's the reason for the celebration. And I think Plato is kind of mocking Agathon a little bit for doing the poetic flourish, mocking poetry a little bit. We know what happens to the poets in the Republic. They more or less all of them get excluded or expelled from the ideal city, except for those poets that like write poems about warfare, whatever would, ennoble virtue and all that shit. So more or less the conservative poets would be kept. And now that brings us to Socrates. And I know we're moving kind of quickly. Sorry. I mean, and I know we've talked a lot, and so we could talk more generally than just going through the speeches, because I don't even feel like we really have enough time to talk about Alcibiades, and he's the most interesting figure. In a certain way, we could have just talked about Alcibiades. So I do want to maybe pause here and suggest to the listener that we've built all the way up to, I think, the key, the denouement of the whole dialogue, which is Socrates' evocation of another, let's say, myth, because it's this myth of Diotima telling him what love is about. And really, the important part, I think, happens after Socrates gives a speech, which is Alcibiades coming in drunk. And Alcibiades is prompted to give praise in praise of love, to tell a story of love, but he's drunk, so he tells a love story. His is completely different than the other six. I'm just going to skip over Socrates' thing because we could spend hours talking about what Socrates does through Diotima. Let's just reduce it to what love is giving. What all of us are pregnant in body and soul. We naturally desire to give birth in presence of the beautiful, right? This whole thing would take hours to unpack. I think that we can say, as we said earlier, there's this direct equation with love and desire. One loves what one does not have, one lacks. And if one has something, we don't love it, we don't desire it, we desire to have it in the future, blah, blah, blah. So this is the whole ontology of lack is like encapsulated in Diotima's speech. I think it would take too long to go over it, but I did want us to give a chance to just, Alcibiades tells a love story. He doesn't give a praise of the universal as we had in Socrates. He gives his praise in the praise of a particular, and the particular is his love of Socrates, right? His falling in love with Socrates. And there's a lot to be said about Alcibiades. One of the things I wanted to give you the chance to talk about, because we did say it, is we've talked a lot about the older man and the younger man, and how this is a relationship of active and passive, where the younger man is supposed to subject himself to the older man so as to be mentored and learn virtue and wisdom. And in that sense, he's passive. And this is a part of the history of sexuality, that it's not about male or male female. Despite the first three speeches, it is about active and passive. The passive figures would be women, slaves, younger men in the Greek sort of love. And so if Alcibiades at first seems like he's the passive young man who's supposed to be courted by Socrates, the suitor, and Socrates resists seducing him, Alcibiades turns the tables and tries to act like the older man, continually inviting Socrates to come eat dinner with him so that Alcibiades can try to seduce him, which also fails. So there is this last image, and I think this can allow us to open up and stop talking about the dialogue, exegetically, and actually talk about some of the themes some more. Is Socrates comes across at the very end as, amazing as he may be and disassociated from the body as he may be in all of these almost extraordinary ways, he comes across as the most unerotic of figures. So, and he's contemplating the forms, right? At this point, he's moved from the love of a particular body to the love of a particular beautiful body to the love of all beautiful bodies, to then the love of the beautiful with a capital B, right? He's kind of transcended the moral coil.
Yeah, there is a lot of interesting reversal here with regard to Socrates and Alcibiades, I guess, the reversal of the pursuit. But just to go back to this position of passivity, this is something that Baudrillard brings up in Seduction, and he kind of reverses it and says it's like what Lacan says about the woman being sort of this, or like, I guess Lacan is placing so much emphasis on the phallus, whereas Baudrillard would say like almost like woman. Well, I was gonna say Lacan would also say that woman would have the phallus. Baudrillard, I think, would definitely say that woman has the phallus. Woman has the power, because the passive means that you don't have to do anything. You come to me because I'm the
Yeah.
boss. I've got the money. I've got what you want. So you pursue me. So why should I'm God? Why do I need, you know what I mean? I don't have to pursue you.
As Zupanchi kind of reads it, man believes or pretends to have the phallus. Woman masks herself as the phallus. No one has it. It's just asymmetrical in a certain way. And in the sexuation diagram, as we talked about, woman with capital W or the crossed out is relating to the phallic position, but from the position of not all. So it is not necessarily about having it or not having it, because again, it's castration imposed in different ways. Just one constitutes the universal positively, and one in a kind of exclusive, non-exclusive negativity. But yeah, I like that way, this way of thinking of man believing he has the phallus or pretending he has the phallus.
Yeah,
right?
I think there's a
Which is
pretending.
alpha male.
There's a simulacrum.
There's a simulating of having it, whereas women masquerades as it, or masks herself as it, as the phallus.
Yeah. But I wonder, like, do you kind of like this problematizing, at least bringing it up as a foil to that, is this idea that men are the weak sex because men are the weak. What was it? How was I was saying it.
Because of the quasi-universal instantiation of patriarchy, they're the ones, as
Right.
Nietzsche says,
Yeah.
Nietzsche says something, and I'll let you continue the thought. Nietzsche says in an aphorism that's famous, and I think it's misread as misogynistic. When going to meet a woman, remember to bring your whip. And the point is, if men were powerful or in power, they wouldn't need to back up their power. Once once the father raises his voice to back up his power, he's already impotent. Right. So I think that's kind of what you were saying.
Yeah.
There's a way of trying to mask the impotence that is the symptom.
So it's almost like instead of the horde killing the primal father, it's the horde gets together to to band together against women, against the threat of women.
Pausanias is like, hey, why? And Phaedrus too, you can see, why don't all the men get together and kill all the women? Then what does the primal father have? Doesn't have anything. If you kill you don't have a horde anymore. You can't hoard the women if there aren't any women.
Interesting. But yeah, I think the constitutive weakness of men with regard to power and satisfaction and knowledge it's all wrapped up together in this very messy kind of way that I think ultimately like that's kind of what I'm compelled by in this particular dialogue is those implications, I suppose.
My only suggestion would be, when we're talking about men and women here, we are talking about masculine and feminine positions, not about biology. We've already said this in previous discussions, but just to reiterate it here for the listener.
Yeah, good idea. To go to that, though, I think what is kind of interesting is the way that, to go back to these notions of the different modalities of human bodies, I think he also brings up there's the earth and there's the sun, but there's also the moon, which is like this intermediary thing. But I also want to bring up, obviously there's a whole tie to madness with lunacy, etc., with this figure of the moon being involved.
In terms of the moon, I know I'm trying to remember which dialogue it was, but keep going with your thought. It's Aristophanes. Now here's why there were three kinds and why they were as I described them. The male kind was originally an offspring of the sun, the female of the earth, and the one that combined both genders was an offspring of the moon, because the moon shares in both. They were spherical, and so was their motion, because they were like their parents in the sky.
It's kind of interesting to have the figure of Diatoma, who is presumably like this oracle. There's the whole ties to like madness and the gods and lunacy. Like the moon is this intermediary position. I don't know exactly how that would fit in per se, but
we know that the moon reflects the sun's sunlight. That's why it shines. Right. And as we've learned, at least, there's not 100% consensus, but there is a prevailing theory about the origin of the moon, which was sort of in the inchoate earth as it was accreting a surface. There was a large impact from some sort of other body, like an asteroid.
Right.
And the moon is supposed to be a satellite of the earth. sort of losing a chunk.
Yeah, which
You
I
know,
think has been proven.
I don't know if it's been definitively proven, but it is interesting that is a prevailing theory, and that Aristophanes, whether or not he's thinking literally in this term or in this mythological terms, that there's like a kind of a truth in there. So yeah, so the androgynous spherical beings would be of the moon. They share both in the earth and the sun. And in the Republic, when Socrates is talking about the cave myth, it's the sun that is the beautiful is the son of no, the son is the offspring of the beautiful, I believe. No, it's the son that's the offspring of the good. Sorry, I mean, like they're related, right? I mean, they're related forms,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah, the son is the offspring of the good.
Here, I can read this bit. This goes to the stuff a little bit that I wanted to dig into. This is from Seduction from Baudrillard. The feminine knows neither equivalence nor value. It is therefore not soluble in power. It is not even subversive. It is reversible. Power, on the other hand, is soluble in the reversibility of the feminine. If the facts cannot decide whether it was the masculine or feminine that was dominant throughout the ages, once again, the thesis of women's oppression is based on a caricatural phallocratic myth. By contrast, it remains clear that in matters of sexuality, the reversible form prevails over the linear form. That's a super interesting little nugget there. The excluded form prevails secretly over the dominant form. The seductive form prevails over the productive form. Femininity, in this sense, is on the same side as madness. It is because madness secretly prevails that it must be normalized, thanks to, amongst other things, the hypothesis of the unconscious. It is because femininity secretly prevails that it must be recycled and normalized, and sexual liberation in particular.
There is a lot to unpack here, but this goes to what I brought up with Phaedrus earlier, where love is associated with a kind of mania, a kind of madness.
Things that would be considered foolish outside of the context of love are acceptable within the context of love.
Pausanias says something like this. He doesn't use the term of madness, but he kind of says, like, in any other case, we would be shamed for acting in such a way, but under the aspects, the auspices of love, this is why love inspires extraordinary acts, because they would be out of the ordinary outside of love, and so they're madness. And this is why Baudrillard are talking about madness needing to be normalized, because it secretly prevails, is a powerful way of. It's threatening, right? I mean, it's threatening to the status quo, to the majoritarian standard,
to the phallogocentric,
to give it its current name. This is why he says, despite the historical agenda, I mean, because majoritarian standards aren't necessarily always going to be the same across history, but in terms of the stereotype across known history, recorded history, we can kind of generalize phallocracy, as he puts it.
yeah.
So, I think that that's important to note. And it kind of, I think this is part of the irony. Again, in each of the speeches, there is ironic twists. I think, including Socrates and his Diotima myth, I think there's an irony in invoking a woman to teach Socrates the art of love, because women are excluded from the symposium, from the banquet, to discuss love, right? You think you might want to have roughly 50% of the population to give their side, but the minoritarian is excluded, women being the minoritarian, again, not because of numbers, statistics, but because of positions of power and standard, right?
Yeah.
If the
Within
male
the social.
if the male is taken as the standard. So that is interesting that Socrates allows this priestess to speak for the feminine in a certain way. And there's all kinds of problematic stuff that we could go into there too, but he allows the minoritarian view to be spoken, which I think, again, we could talk about appropriations of sexual reproduction as metaphor, and I think that holds valid, and that, but I do think also what Plato is trying to do then is align philosophy as a minoritarian point of view, as opposed
that's
to
kind of like Laruelle vibe, right? A
well,
little bit, right?
maybe I let me get to Laruelle, because that's interesting. I would say that Plato is proposing philosophy being spoken, its truth being spoken from the mouth of a woman, even if it's through Socrates' mouth. he's being her
A pure simulacra.
he's being
Poor
her puppet.
simulacra.
He's being
Yeah.
her puppet or something, if you want. She's his muse. It's the minority position of woman that is correlative to philosophy's more minoritarian position, because in a certain sense, in terms of philosophy's power, it loses out to poetry and loses out to sophistry every time. This is why two things. One, Plato, another irony against Socrates, the one figure that is most directly criticized is Socrates with the figure of Alcibiades, drunk or not. And Alcibiades raving like let's see, he's the orator of Dionysus, if you want to be. He's the only one that's still drunk in this, even if everybody else is hungover, he's drunk, and he's the one criticizing Socrates, and he's the one who calls Socrates a sophist. Socrates' use of words is seductive and is ensorcelling and enchanting. So I think that's one of the last digs, is Plato then kind of suggests, what if philosophy were taken to be sophistry? Not that it always is at bottom sophistry, but what if it were taken to be sophistry by, whether it be the masses or Alcibiades, who is not of the masses. He is like a general.
Right. Bourgeois, yeah.
I mean, bourgeois is maybe not even good enough. He's a man
Right.
of power. He is leading armies, because Plato is concerned with, I mean, his fantasy is the philosopher king.
Right.
So in reality, Alcibiades is a recalcitrant student, because Alcibiades knows very well from Socrates' words, he's the one person, he says, Socrates is the one person that makes him feel shame, that makes him feel like he should be a better man and be doing better things. And yet he knows very well, and yet
the fetish.
He resists and sticks to the love of particular bodies, particularly the love of Socrates. He's infatuated with them. It's to the point of jealousy and rage and anger, to the point of madness, right? Because Socrates even says, like, protect me from Alcibiades. He's gonna
come sit down in between us.
He's gonna fucking beat me. He's gonna fucking beat me. And we do, as I mentioned earlier, like Alcibiades, his political leanings were changing with the winds. He fought for Athens, and he fought against Athens, and he fought outside of the Greek state. But Plato's fantasy is this fantasy of the philosopher king. So Alcibiades, as this recalcitrant student who is shown the correct path and yet fails to do it. I mean, this gives the lie to something Socrates says elsewhere, which is that, men would not do evil if they knew better, right? That knowledge would prevent them from acting immorally and badly. And this is given the lie. This is shown to, again, be an ideal and a fantasy.
Truth and beauty and their correspondence and etc. knowledge, right? Again, I just think those things are just so intimately bound up here, as though they were those, anatomically combined humans that Zeus had.
But Plato shows that dialectic to also be potentially be faulty, right? Because Alcibiades is supposed to move in the dialectic that Diotima shows from the love of a particular body, Socrates, to the love of, from a particular beautiful body to the love of all beautiful bodies, to the love of the beautiful. And he can't stop past that empirical encounter of the one fascinating, he gets stuck, he gets fixated, right?
The fetish, yeah.
Exactly. Which is a kind of perversion if you consider the Diotima dialectic. And so I think this is why at the end, another final flourish of the irony, the night after everyone goes to sleep, Socrates and Aristophanes and Agathon, Socrates and the two poets, the tragedian and the comedian, are still drinking. And Socrates is just about to land his main point about why someone who writes tragedies should be able to write comedies and vice versa. But the poets are too drunk and they fall asleep before he can make his point. So I think that that's important, because I think this is kind of what the dialogue is doing, specifically with the figure of Alcibiades. Alcibiades is a tragic figure. As I said, the dialogue itself is kind of written within a year or two of Alcibiades' untimely assassination. So Alcibiades is this tragic figure because he is so self-mocking in his, even if he's mocking Socrates, he's also not taking himself too seriously, and he's mocking himself. He's like, I can't believe, I fell for this guy. He didn't fall for my good looks. I know I'm beautiful, but even I couldn't seduce Socrates. I can't believe he makes me feel like shit because I should do better. So like he is mixing comedy and tragedy. I think Plato is, through the move of irony. And I think that's why we should consider the Symposium not just as a work of philosophy, but kind of what it's been called, a middle work. But usually when it's called a middle work, it's chronologically middle. I think it should be considered a middle work because it is a middle work in the sense in which its dramatization is meant to prepare us for the drier, less literarily inspired dialogues like the Parmenides or something like this. Which doesn't mean that the Parmenides or the other dialogues are any less staged, just that this is supposed to prepare us for that more abstract and etherealized thinking. We're supposed to be moved by the comedy and tragedy in that figure of Alcibiades. And I think that
The
him
Chad,
mock
out Chadbiades.
yeah, Alcibiades, exactly. I mean, I think I think that we're supposed to see ourselves not just in the friend hearing this at the very beginning from Apollodorus, but I think we're supposed to see ourselves in someone like Alcibiades, because he's the one figure that shows what it looks like when
Yes,
we are in love.
right,
He's
correct.
not just
Yeah,
talking about it; he is showing it.
fools rush in. Yeah,
So there's a total difference between a discourse on love and the demonstration of being in love. And so Alcibiades is extremely important for giving context to something like the philosophical dialectic of Diotima. I really do think Alcibiades is supposed to be read in juxtaposition with Diotima's speech, because if Diotima's speech is this kind of, again, this kind of divine thinking where we can remove ourselves from particular bodies after we've dabbled in, the encounters with a beautiful body to all beautiful bodies, and then we're able to contemplate the forms. Alcibiades can show us that very easily this doesn't happen, that philosophy is a rare and difficult thing, right? It's hard to go to work through our kind of particular attachments.
that's good. I like that. I was not thinking that way, but I like that a lot, particularly in that context of this is almost too. I mean, this is being a bit fast and loose with it, but like there is a sort of group analysis going on in a certain sense, like a type of
Yeah,
free associative not dialogue, but whatever this would be, pluralogue.
I like the notion of a group session, of a group analysis, in terms of the group of privileged men. And I say that roughly. I mean, these are powerful men, men of means, participating in a private setting, which is
But it's like
only,
there's something's being, I guess something is being spoken that is more than the content of what is being said
yeah,
here.
yeah.
And maybe that's just the nature of the written dialogue. Maybe I'm giving that too much of a.
No, I think that's good. And I will say that to talk about the working through of love, not just
I
of
mean,
what
with the
love is,
transference, I
but
mean, with
of
the
love,
the
yeah, with
transference between Alcibiades and Socrates is like an interesting little part of it
yeah.
too, right?
I mean, that gives it a real life example that the other speeches just don't really touch. And without Alcibiades bursting into the private session, because that's kind of how it happens, right? Is after Socrates gives a speech, there's this loud clamor, there's this drunken revelry, and Alcibiades kind of breaks into this peaceful contemplative session, and real life bursts back in after Socrates.
The real,
I mean, yeah, you could say that. And so I think that with what's interesting is that there is this tension for a kind of wholeness, whether it be in Aristophanes' kind of comedic sense, in his mythical sense, or in the sense in which there's a wholeness of removal from all erotic attachment in Diotima's dialectic through Socrates and the figure of Socrates. And there's also this tension of, yet Socrates is still drawing in again, kind of in this cult-like way, these followers, these people that are obsessed with him and in love with him. The guy who hears the story, Aristodemus, he doesn't give a speech, but he's called obsessed with Socrates at the time. And Martha Nussbaum says it really well when she's kind of reading this tension, where she says, Eros is the desire. Eros is the desire to be a being without any contingent occurrent desires. It is a second order desire. It is a second order desire that all desires should be canceled. In the dialectic of desire that you brought up earlier, in the circuit of desire, desire is always desiring to continue desiring. And so, this interesting notion of wholeness, which is a fantasy, as Lacan kind of makes
Right.
clear, would be this second order desire that would cancel all desires, which gives us figures that Freud himself used, like the Nirvana principle, when he's talking about the satisfaction of a drive is to eliminate tension. And sometimes he's like, keep it at a minimum. Sometimes he's like, lift the vent. But sometimes he thinks of it as a complete evacuation, that's how he kind of reads the pleasure principles at times as a nirvana principle, as a kind of extermination of desire.
Yeah, where there's no surplus, where it's all used up. I mean, that's what Baudrillard, I think that's why he's so into the poetics to remember, because like every term, all the syllables cancel out one another.
The anagrams,
The
yeah.
anagrams, right? Sorry.
No, you're right. The poetics, yeah.
I do want to,
Abolishing remainders.
yeah, I do want to read these 3 little sections because they go to irony and seduction, just to highlight these aspects of Socrates and Alcibiades. It is going to be 3 quotes. The first one from seduction, the third one from seduction, and then I'll highlight the other one from our actual reading. It is substituted at the end of the determinate representation of sex as the flotation of the law that regulates the difference between the sexes. The ascent of the feminine corresponds to both the apogee of sexual pleasure and a catastrophe relative to sex's reality principle. And so it is femininity that is gripping in the present and the fatal situation of sex's hyperreality, as it was yesterday, but in direct contrast in irony and seduction. Now, I believe this is actually Alcibiades.
I don't know what the fuck any of that means, but
You can't imagine how little he cares whether a person is beautiful or rich or famous in any other way that most people admire. He considers all these possessions beneath contempt, and that's exactly how he considers all of us as well. In public, I tell you, his whole life is one big game, a game of irony. So this is Alcibiades speaking of Socrates, who spurns his, what would you say, his attempts at seduction. And then I'm going to return to seduction here from Baudrillard. There is an alternative to sex and power, one that psychoanalysis cannot know because its axiomatics are sexual. And yes, this alternative is undoubtedly the order of the feminine, understood outside the opposition masculine-feminine, that opposition being essentially masculine, sexual in intention, and incapable of being overturned without ceasing to exist. This strength of the feminine is that of seduction. I mainly just want to hammer home, I guess, this reversibility of these positions that Socrates embodies, this potential Lacanian notion of feminine jouissance that is a threat to the philogocentric order. You could see this like literally play out with the figure of Socrates being killed by Athens, right? Because for what? For leading the youth astray with this irony,
corrupting the youth.
this
Impiety
sophistry,
corrupting the
right?
youth. Yeah.
Exactly, which is kind of interesting, right? If you look in the figure of Alcibiades, it's like there's a carnality or like there's an embodied desire that is supposed to be repressed, right? Like it's the feminine.
Is it supposed to be suppressed? I mean,
Well, I
like,
don't know. Like I'm kind of thinking out.
I mean, like
thinking out
in the dialogue, Agathon, whom they're celebrating, the
Mhm.
tragic poet who holds the banquet, he's the host. He's remarked upon as being super beautiful, right? His name is Good Man, but he should be like hot. He should be like hot dude, right? And then Alcibiades comes in. He's the only one that really could give Agathon a run for his money for how beautiful he's supposed to be. So it's interesting that Socrates is seated between them, or
Yeah.
that's
I mean,
like
in the context of
I mean,
the
Socrates. Well, yeah. I mean, Socrates is supposed to be in his 50s. He's supposed to be like 53 or whatever. Agathon and Alcibiades are in their 30s, right? So they're really coming into manhood in Athenian sense. So Socrates is an older man, but they're all adult men, and Socrates is known as snub-nosed. He's ugly. I mean, that's kind of how Nietzsche puts it directly, but he's basically ugly in body. And
Right.
it's not Socrates who seduces Alcibiades. It's Socrates' words. It's the words it's the logos that seduces
Okay.
Alcibiades. And
Good distinction.
this is why Alcibiades levels the charge of sophistry at Socrates. And it's not necessarily, and I think this is Plato's irony, to bring it back to irony seduction. It's Plato's highlighting the fact that only following the words and not the method, not the underlying form of the words, is then philosophy sophistry.
Got it.
Is that if philosophy is merely taken for its rhetoric and not for the movement of the ideas, if it's merely taken for the logos in its own masturbatory movement, that's when it's seductive, that's when it's sophistry. And so I don't think Plato is just trying to ironically say Socrates is no better than a sophist. I think it's that from Alcibiades' point of view, insofar as he doesn't know what to do with philosophy, which is this foreign body implanted in his soul that's making him feel shame, but he doesn't know what to do with it, and he doesn't know how to allow it to flourish and generate a philosopher. He resists that. He still vies for power, for political power, and all these other things without being able to integrate
because
philosophy.
I have something good to follow up.
He's not able to integrate philosophy into that movement. He only considers the movement of the words that Socrates is sort of bombarding him with. And that's why he will claim that Socrates is this, is doing the sophistry. And he has these other metaphors about, Socrates, we could call it the agalma, right? He's got these statues in him that are godlike and stuff like this, right? That he'll say. But go ahead.
So this is Socrates addressing Alcibiades, and I think it goes to that very kind of phallic logic that you were kind of skirting towards. Dear Alcibiades, if you are right in what you say about me, you are already more accomplished than you think. If I really have in me the power to make you a better man, then you can see in me a beauty that is really beyond description and makes your own remarkable good looks pale in comparison. But then, is this a fair exchange that you propose? You seem to me to want more than your proper share. You offer me the merest appearance of beauty, and in return, you want the thing itself, gold in exchange for bronze.
That's Socrates' biggest insult to Alcibiades. Is like, okay, you claim I can make you a better man. And I've already described how that tension is in Alcibiades, because whether or not he's able to integrate that and do that is another thing. That's not Socrates' role. His role is to inspire these feelings of virtue and whatever. What you can lead a horse to water. But Socrates is like, okay, so I promote in you, I inspire in you the desire to become a better man. That makes me beautiful. You,
Right.
on the other hand, you who know you are a sexy motherfucker and are gorgeous, you can't make me a better man.
Ooh,
So
yeah.
why do I give you the time of day?
Right.
And that's ultimately why Socrates is in this dialogue unerotic, because none of the speakers, none of the figures can inspire in him this desire to ascend. And that's why he's not turned on by them. There's nothing, he gets hard on philosophy, he gets hard on the forms, but none of them can help him reach that. So, he's softcore porn or whatever, right? It's not the thing. I will say we've almost been going 3 hours, by the way. Do you have one more quote? Do you want to end on?
No, I think we could possibly close there.
But I do think it's good to bring that out, that quote. That quote encapsulates Socrates, why he rebuffs Alcibiades. And I don't think Alcibiades knows how to respond, right? Because Alcibiades he's the playboy. He knows himself to be beautiful.
It's funny because he gives him the gift that can't be reciprocated. It's like a
Yeah.
potlatch in miniature in that
Mhm.
sense. Look, I've given you this. I've given you the desire for virtue. What can you give me in return? You can't match my gift that I've just like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I mean, Socrates he's not fixated on getting his rocks off, getting another beautiful body. He's already moved on from
yeah,
beautiful bodies. And so it would take something more, something beyond the jouissance of the organ. Since you were bringing that up
something
earlier,
sublime, the
I think
sublime,
I think now I kind of see why you were
sublimation.
associating feminine jouissance and Socrates, right?
I mean,
kind
it's
of see I kind of see what you're doing. I see what you're getting at now. And at the end of the dialogue, one of the last things we hear about is Socrates goes into a kind of trance after Aristophanes and Agathon fall asleep listening to him discourse about why tragedy writers should be able to write comedies and vice versa. He leaves and then he goes and stands, in this trance, in this meditative trance, in this kind of, it's an ecstasy. He has an ecstasy.
ataraxia.
We don't get to hear about what he is meditating on, what he is ecstatically experiencing. That's beyond the realm of description, and that's what we have to fill in. So I think that you're right I now see what you're getting at, where he's forgone the pleasures of the body and the jouissance of the organ, and that allows him to kind of experience the other face of God, one of the other faces of God, as Lacan says. So that's good.
Well, that will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor
The very
Atkins.
roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.